We do have a quick quiz to start you off. So you should have on your screen a metacognition quiz for you to start off. The very first question is more about your familiarity with evidence for learning and the work that we do. So there's just one quick question there around if you have used and seen the guidance report. Metacognition, also in terms of the questions here, we're just starting to unpack some of the concepts. So if you pull that up on your bar, you'll see that you have got 5 questions to answer. So just we'll give you a moment to work through that. So to end the poll for you, we have unpacked. So within our first question, really good to see that we've got a mix of familiarity. Metacognition in, these next ones really were sort of not trick questions, but we like to throw a few curly ones in there. We are looking really at the misconceptions around metacognition, that it's only developed in students in upper primary and secondary, which we've got 100% strike rate on that one. Completely false. We can definitely develop metacognition in students of all ages, but it just looks very different from a primary setting to a middle years and secondary setting. And not only in the way that it's developed, but in the way that it's taught. Metacognition is a general skill that must be separated from subject knowledge. This one's a little bit of a tricky one because although it can be separated, a lot of the learning that goes into it is better placed with context beside it. And we'll unpack a few of those contexts as well. So that one we say is false. Metacognition as a higher order thinking and therefore more important than cognition or subject knowledge. This does lean a little bit on the previous question. So we do have a variety of approaches, but certainly without cognition or subject knowledge, metacognition itself can become a little bit redundant. So the two hand in hand, that's where the important piece sits. And I was really pleased that this last one, when I changed the wording, metacognition knowledge and strategies can be taught in distinct thinking skills lessons. Absolutely they can, but it's also good to be taught explicitly throughout your other areas of learning, and we'll start to unpack that throughout the webinar today. So we might just take a step back there and pause, listen to a few of the thoughts from our team and unpacking the context that we're bringing to you. So I'll leave Tanya to introduce herself in just a moment, but we'll start with the work that we're doing through the guidance report a little. We're also going to talk about expectations shortly. But so Susanna Schriefel, as the lead on the guidance reports, we're really working at making evidence actionable in this space, to bring recommendations based on the best evidence that we can find with our partners at the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, so that it is usable for teachers in classrooms. Really, a lot of them are written for school leaders, because we really strongly believe that without support of a school leader, most things don't have the ability to grow and scale as they otherwise would. I'll hand over to Tanya to introduce herself, and I'm also going to invite her to talk a little bit about why we've decided that metacognition and self-regulated learning is a place that we're keen to look at, and we'll dive into the toolkit through this part as well. So we'll just see if we can get the toolkit up there.
Great, thanks Susanna. Great to be joining you virtually, albeit from Melbourne, but I will be up in Darwin tomorrow, so I'll see you then. As Susanna was saying, we're going to start off by having a look at the teaching and learning toolkit, just as a beginning point into looking at what is the impact of metacognition and self-regulation that we can expect or hope for in our students after implementing it. So this is just a bit of background to the toolkit. It's really there to support evidence-informed decision-making at the school level. As Susanna was saying, leaders and teachers are both important in evidence-informed decision-making. And it's particularly interested in helping those students that come from backgrounds that are surrounded by disadvantage, and prefaces that research. So if we have a look at the live site, so if you click along with me, if we click along the guidance reports that we're drawing from today, if you want to access those, and we'll send you links out at the end of this as well, they're just here as well. So this is the work that Susanna's leading up. We also have in the room as well Dr. Pauline Ho, who's leading up the work around the Learning Impact Fund, and she's on our chat box today. So feel free to reach out with any questions as we go along, and also let us know where you're coming in from today. It's always great to know where you're coming in from, and what role you play would be fantastic. So if we click on the toolkits and then we click on the teaching and learning toolkit, so this is in looking from primary age to secondary aged students. If we click on all approaches full toolkit, and then we can sort by name, average cost, evidence security, or months of impact. If we have a look by name and just scroll down to look at metacognition and self-regulation, you can see the headline figures are really quite exciting, because we've got a +7 months worth of learning progress, and that's our second highest impact within the teaching and learning toolkit, the first going to feedback. We can see that there's a really high number of padlocks, and padlocks indicate to us the depth and breadth and security of that evidence. So it lets us know there's been 4 high quality recent meta-analyses that have been published in this area. And then we can also see that the cost is low as well, which is always a welcome sight to educators, I think, across the country. So if we click on metacognition and self-regulation to have a little bit of a look at what the information we provide, and here we have a definition. Susanna will be taking you through the definition in more detail, so I won't stop at this point here. And then we have how effective is it, how secure is the evidence, what are the costs, and what should I consider. This what should I consider being really the heart of the toolkit in helping you change evidence into practice in your setting, and provides you with the most practical information. Even a step further than that, and I hate to say it because that's Susanna's work, but I will say it, is the guidance reports take it even that step further. I don't really hate to say it, I love it to say it. All right, so if we look at our references then, and we can have a look at some of the studies that underpin that +7 months of learning progress. So that's been translated from a mean weighted effect size, which you can see here, of 0.54, and we've translated that into 0.7, into 7 months worth of learning progress, in addition to more normal learning within that year, because we think that that's a more tangible way for educators to relate to those types of figures rather than an effect size. So if we have a look then a little bit further, and we'll be taking a look, we'll be jumping back in the slide deck soon and looking at some of the different research that sits under and makes up that 0.52 or 7 months. And we also have our Australasian research summary that's been pulled together by Melbourne Graduate School of Education here as well, if you want to have a look at what specifically do we have in Australia, both qualitative and quantitative research in metacognition and self-regulation. So if we just jump back into the deck, if we have a look here, and you can see the spread, there's quite a large spread, and what we've got here along the y-axis is just our effect size, and the x-axis is just in alphabetical order. If we have a look at Abrami versus Lozinski, what we can see is 2 very different effect sizes, and you can see there's a large spread of effect sizes there. And if we have a little bit of a look and think, okay, well, what's the difference between Abrami in comparison to Lozinski? Abrami, what the key area of focus was for those included within that meta-analysis was really looking at critical thinking. And there was a wide range of studies that were implemented in that. In fact, it draws from 117 studies, and it was really heterogeneous studies. So lots of different studies with wide and varying. So average effect size, as you can see, of 0.34, But the standard deviation for you stats lovers out there, myself mainly, but no, for you as well, was 0.61. So it's a massive standard deviation. So the way that it was actually implemented caused a lot of variance within that. If we compare that to Lazinski, which is actually looking at self-regulated strategy instruction, specifically in students with emotional and behavioural disorders. And what that does is actually provide a scaffold, and it was looking at writing, and it has a scaffold for writing that has discuss it, how are you going to model that, how are you going to make your own, then how are you going to support that, and then supporting independent performance. So this is a really well scaffolded, really well implemented and well understood way of using metacognition, well, in comparison to critical thinking, which used a wide array of different studies, and that's why we see the differences within those effect sizes. Now, there's hundreds of different stories, and I encourage you to delve into all of them there and dig into the beautiful differences between those different meta-analyses. If we then take a look at what are some actual techniques that we know that can make a difference to our students. So this is taken from a Delonsky paper that was published in 2013. Also, it's within the guidance report as well. And what I've done here in working with Susanna, we wrote this piece for Teacher magazine that came out just at the end of last year, is saying, okay, we know that there are different ways that students can study. Now, what are some of the more effective in comparison to some of the more less effective ways that students can actually study? So we can see right up the top with high utility is practice testing. So that's revising information with, say, with flashcards, testing, students testing each other. What's nice about this research, well, I find nice about this research, this was conducted by Dr. Jack Leggett, who I've been fortunate to work with last year and working with this year as well, and Susanna's working with him as well up in Queensland. So it's a Queensland study where they found that there wasn't really a difference in retrieval practice if they used hints or not. So I think that that was an interesting finding, but you can see that it's got really high utility and really can help students in learning material. Then we've got distributed practice. That's where we have a gap of either ranging from 1 day to a week between practicing the same skills. That's different from interleaved practice. Interleaved, as the name suggests, you're practicing different types of similar things all interleaved together, and then you leave a gap and practice it again. So the example there is looking at how do you calculate the volume of different geometric solids. So looking at 4 different solids and then calculating that volume on the 4 solids, and then in leaving a week and trying that again. Now, a lot of things that I used to see when I was a teacher, I still am a teacher, actually, I am a teacher. You see a lot of summarizing, a lot of highlighting. Look, I can do that myself as well. These are getting into the lower utility. It's the same with rereading and using mnemonics as well. That's not to say that those techniques can't be helpful in the consolidation and the learning of initial knowledge, but not so much when we're trying to encourage knowledge transfer and into other areas and connections between different study areas. So now I'm going to hand back to Susanna.
Thanks, Tanya. So from all of this research, the toolkit, also those practices that Tanya was speaking about, our colleagues in the UK at the Education Endowment Foundation built a guidance report based on the best available evidence. That was around building recommendations, as they have for many other areas. Our work in Australia at E4L is to contextualise this and help to add research to the bank. so that we can build out a better ecosystem for evidence. So these are the 7 recommendations that sit within our education guidance report on metacognition and self-regulated learning. And we're really deliberate around self-regulated learning as opposed to self-regulation because of the understanding of that word particularly. So our 7 recommendations are, and we're not going to look at each of them in detail, but we will pick up a couple of the examples, particularly out of recommendation 2. So we start with teachers should acquire the professional understanding and skills to develop their students' metacognitive knowledge. And you'll see that repeated through a few of the themes. They should explicitly teach students metacognitive strategies, including how to plan, monitor and evaluate their learning. Again, those key words in there: monitor, plan, evaluate. Teachers should be able to model their own thinking to help students develop metacognitive strategies and cognitive skills. They should set an appropriate level of challenge to develop self-regulation and metacognition, to promote and develop metacognitive talk in the classroom, explicitly teach students how to organise and effectively manage their learning independently, and that's particularly prominent at secondary level. And the 7th really ties back into the first, that schools should support teachers to develop knowledge of those approaches and also expect them to be applied in a really appropriate and consistent way. So those are the 7 recommendations. We're going to dive into number 2, but first we'll just give you a bit of an idea about how we think about metacognition and self-regulation, because they have quite a unique relationship and it can often be open for interpretation. So on the next slide, you'll see this relationship spelled out. Self-regulated learning really is our umbrella term. Within that sits 3 core dimensions. The first being cognition, the second metacognition, and the third motivation. And the reason that our guidance report focuses on the metacognition element of self-regulated learning is because we've got some really amazing evidence that will support us to be quite deliberate in the recommendations that we give to schools. It's definitely not to say that the others are less important, but we can be a lot more concrete in our thinking around metacognition. There are some really good examples, and one actually comes from our guidance report. So this just provides a short introduction through Freya. Freya is a student who is having some trouble with spelling, particularly at the pace of the spelling test that her teacher gives. So she sits in class and she becomes quite anxious about it. She works through all of these stages, but particularly in pulling away what are the strategies that her teacher is giving her. So can she use mnemonics, for example, to sound out the word surprise with 2 R's. So it's surprise in her practice, and therefore when that comes up with the teacher, she can repeat that in her head and repeat the word and spell the word correctly. So there's lots of these small stories that are built into our guidance reports that will start to explain the relationship that we have. So while we call it metacognition and self-regulated learning, it really is the metacognition within self-regulated learning. Cognition and motivation can't be pulled out to be completely separate. We totally understand and admit that, but these 3 pieces are sort of interactive through all of the dimensions. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about how we construct metacognition. And again, you'll see this language from our recommendations: planning, monitoring and evaluating as part of the process. This piece looks at the cognition and metacognition relationship. So there's tasks, and built within that, the process that sits around the student. Not that one is more important than the other. Metacognition doesn't sit above cognition other than to diagrammatically express it, but we sit it as a cycle and both feed into one another. So the types of questions that we would ask around planning for a student is what is the goal of this? What kind of information do I need to collect and find? And how much time will I need to be able to do this well? As they start through the process, they can start to monitor. So do they have an understanding of what they're doing? Are they starting to progress towards those goals that they've set for themselves? Are the strategies that they're using working? And if they're not, how can they tweak and change those? And through to evaluation. So this is the sort of post-questioning. Have I reached the goal that I set for myself? What worked, what didn't work well, what would I change for next time? So those types of questions and really equipping your students with those types of questions is going to help in this process. If we think about it a little bit further on, and we'll break down cognition and metacognition as well through the next slide, there's two dimensions sitting within metacognition. One is metacognitive knowledge, and the next is metacognitive regulation. So there'll be descriptors popping up on your screen in a moment. I'll let you read them rather than reading them to you. So we'll give you a little bit of breathing time so that you don't have to listen to Tanya and I to absorb the strategies here. So in summarising these, it's really about the what learners know and the what learners do. The next slide pictures these dimensions and what sits underneath them. So this is sort of the next level down. It's a helpful way to start to describe to your students where the input is, and you'll see it come up in a moment. Metacognitive knowledge sitting at the top, the knowledge of tasks, knowledge of strategy, so what they do when they see a task, how they respond to that, and also the knowledge of self, how they react to that as a human, as an individual. Metacognitive regulation goes back to those three keywords again, the planning, the monitoring and evaluating, and that goes back to those questions that we just explored as well. Coming from a secondary background and having taught very small primary, very little primary rather, not the small people, but the slightly bigger people for a shorter amount of time. Tanya and I are both going to start exploring a couple of these examples through one really interesting framework, which is quite a tangible tool to use in your classrooms. This is a 7-step model for explicitly teaching metacognition, and it works through from a sort of heavy teacher focus to a heavy student focus, like a gradual release of responsibility. We're going to look at two examples. I'm going to start with the primary example, and then I'm going to flick across to Tanya. And I've chosen an example from HPE, having done work in that area, but also because it's one of the areas and the subject areas that's a little bit harder to conceptualize in this way, and perhaps not the examples that are used in the literature so much. So I'm working with my year 4s on T-ball, for example. I know that my students have done throwing in the past, and what I'm really hoping that they'll get out of this is the understanding of field play and throwing the ball and moving the ball effectively. They've done lots of throwing games in the past, and so they've got the basic skills, and they might have even used sort of word sentences to help them with that. So a point to direction, a step forward and a release as 3 key words that are going to repeat in their head as they do the activity. Those types of tools are things that students can hold on to help them translate those skills. So I'm going to activate prior knowledge by asking my students to think about when they've used throwing before, and it might be in a sport, it might just be with their friend at the playground. And then we're going to start to unpack through that prior knowledge, what were the key points, the key techniques that they needed to do to make that a successful throw. As we've unpacked that, we're going to move into the explicit instruction of the strategy. So for our throwing this time, we're going to use a really simple point where you want the ball to go, step forward and release, stepping forward with the opposite foot. That's going to be repeating in their head as they do the activities all the way through to their structured reflection when they're doing that independently. I'm going to talk then about modelling, and it might be that I do that myself, or it might be that I choose a student who I know can complete the skill, giving them an opportunity to model to their classmates so that I can repeat that cycle and repeat that word as that student's performing a task. We then work as a class to memorise that strategy. We might not even use the ball at this stage, but it's just the saying and the movement that correlates with that. So building in that sort of muscle memory piece. As we do guided practice, we introduce the ball, we work as a class and we stay together, still repeating that really simple sentence structure that's going to help us to create this and also translate this skill into other areas. My students can then work independently with a partner to practice and practice and practice this. And then they can go back and start to tweak and reflect on their practice. So if I release the ball up in the air, what does that do to my accuracy and distance? How can I get the ball where I want to go? Well, it worked better the first time and I released it at a much later point than I did the second time, where the ball went all the way up in the air but landed short of my target. So that's a sort of example that we could use with our students. It's creating transferability of skills, because I can then take that to another sport or another concept and say, remember how we used that sentence in our mind, and repeat it and repeat it and repeated it to help us really articulate, really be accurate with our skill. So Tanya, I'll introduce you to talk about a very different example and a secondary example.
Thank you, Susanna. I love that. Yeah, that was a great example. So for me, I'll pull from my secondary years as a high school teacher, specifically biology. Who doesn't love it? I love it particularly a lot. So my example is going to be structuring students in their ability in using a hierarchical concept map. Love hierarchical concept maps. Those of you that know me just love it. So at the start, we're going to, as a class, we're going to look at and have a look and see, well, students activating prior knowledge around concept maps. They've most likely done concept maps throughout their scientific studies, also in other subjects as well. Don't want to leave the English people behind. I know that they can be helpful in English as well. And so first of all, they'll look and see, well, what's a concept map? And then, okay, a hierarchical concept map, how is that different from a concept map? So I'll be explicitly telling them that the idea of that is that you have the largest concepts at the top, and then you have the smaller concepts as you go down. So we'll start off and I will show them my concept map, which will be about cells excitedly. They'll start off, they'll have one cell at the top, and then it will go down into two branches, and they'll have eukaryotic cells and then prokaryotic cells as well, so plant cells and animal cells. And then underneath that, excitedly, look at me, I'm getting so excited, they're going to have the organelles, and then inside of that, they're going to have DNA, and DNA is a marvelous thing. So then what I'm going to say to them is, well, this is my hierarchical concept map. Now I want you to sit down, and I'll give them a partially completed concept map of the cell structure, and I want them to sit down and to go through, and this is me modeling the learning strategy, and then them using that as guided practice. Through practicing, they'll be memorizing the strategy, and then I'll say to them, okay, it's time for me to let you go off into the world, and I want you to choose a subject that you would like to draw a hierarchical concept map in science for, specifically in biology for a key concept. It will be up to them what they develop it in. It could be looking at the intricacies, I would encourage them, of genetics perhaps, or maybe they were looking at anatomy as well. That can be interesting to some as well, I've heard. But they would go away and they would then independently practice that skill, and then they would do a structured reflection upon the way that they completed their hierarchical concept map. So that would be the way that I would teach them through that, and get them to the point where that became a tool that they would be able to use independently for my great year 12 kids, because they're always my kids. All right, so that is me showing that.
I might just off script, Tanya, and ask, because I think there were some good comments in there. We have left good time for questions when we get to the end of this, to please use the Q&A box to ask us any questions that you have. But also, if you have got particular tools that are helpful or that you find really useful, and I know that the 7 steps really does resonate with a lot of people, and there were some comments into that extent, which is terrific. Thank you. We'd really love you to share those in the chat box with your colleagues. There looks to be a very good conversation happening in there between old friends already. So please feel free to share anything that you have got that's useful. And if you can see other ways that these types of approaches and types of tools can be used, we would really like you to share those as well. So the 7 steps and a number of other practices and resources are in the guidance report, which I know that Pauline is sharing the links with you now, which is terrific. We really ask that you provide your feedback to us on those types of things. If you're using them in a slightly different way in your context, all of that's really, really helpful. But the next little bit, and I'll throw back to Tanya as well, sorry to interrupt you, T, is the school and classroom implications for these types of strategies for metacognition.
Yes, so as Susanna was really saying at the start, and as we know through looking at implementation science as well, we really need there to be a commitment from the leadership staff. And then that filters down really into a whole culture and a commitment across the school. So this will start off, as it always does, with planning that involves all the stakeholders across the school to ensure that metacognition is being embedded in a thoughtful and meaningful manner throughout the different, say, subject areas, if you're in secondary, and subject areas as well if you're in primary, and that the right techniques are being used and strategies are being talked about across those different subjects, because they are very subject specific, especially if you think of something as beautiful and rich as arts-based subjects. You can imagine in every single one of the arts forms, each one of the strategies are quite different. And then we're talking about, well, how can we build the professional capacity of the teachers, of the workforce that are in the classroom 24/7 doing the work, in actually knowing what strategies are useful when and what strategies are useful specifically within their subject area. So we'll need to have professional learning for that. We know that one-off is helpful, but in moving that into practice within the classroom, it's really helpful if we have follow-up coaching with that, whether that be within instructional coaching from peers or coaching from externals as well can be helpful. We know that from implementation sites that is really crucial in making small changes in teaching practice, in implementing metacognition in the classroom. So then we're really thinking about how we're going to integrate metacognition with other high impact strategies, such as feedback. And I think we have someone actually on the line that implemented a lovely program of feedback within their school. That's Robin there. And that was specifically looking at the self-regulation and how that was being evidenced through the feedback. How were you looking at student self-regulation, and then how are you providing feedback on that? So they can be really effective to go together, feedback and metacognition. So as I was saying, really subject specific and domain specific areas of metacognitive strategies. The 2 examples that Susanna and I talked about are subject specific ways of thinking about what's a good metacognitive strategy, and they're very different and very distinct, and that's why we don't see a great deal of transferability with that type of learning. And then we need to monitor and track our implementation, which is the really exciting bit, is where the rubber hits the road, and then you're saying, well, how much of the school is actually embedding this into their practice? How common are we seeing these metacognitive practices occurring within the classrooms? And what does that really look like? And then how are our students then making choices to use the right strategies at the right time to really improve their learning to the best possible degree. So that's at the whole school level. All right, so that is at the school level. Then what about at the classroom level? And when we're looking at the classroom level, this is the level that I love. Well, I love leadership level as well, but really this is where the actions that can change students' lives occur. So we're really encouraging and making sure that, as we were talking in that 7-step model, is that we're really modeling and encouraging metacognitive talk within the classroom. So if we're actually walking through something up on the board or delightfully within an experiment, we're explaining to the students as we go what is happening, how we're monitoring, how we're evaluating, how we're planning. How do we set that up? So if we're about to do, I'll jump out of my comfort area. If we're about to do a painting, we're deciding on what materials we'll choose, what brushes will we choose, what are the brush strokes that we'll choose to depict that right area. All right, and then we're setting with the students clear learning goals and helping them to plan how to achieve them. We're really explicitly teaching the students how to plan, monitor and evaluate as they go, supported by learning tools. And we were talking through some of those more effective learning tools such as spaced practice or interleave practice just before. So we can implement those within our classroom so we know that we're giving our students the best possible chance of learning rather than them highlighting away, which may look productive but generally doesn't lead to large increases in learning. And then we're really modelling, as I was saying. What can be, I think, is difficult as a teacher is setting the appropriate level of challenge to each student, and also helping the students to really develop their level of self-regulation and metacognition to wherever they're at the moment. I think the idea of within another approach of within class achievement grouping is useful in scaffolding that, because you will have students with very different levels of achievement currently within your classroom. You'll have the same levels of achievement in variation in metacognition and self-regulation as well. And so you'll need to scaffold them depending on where they're at currently. So then it's really about the 7-step model of the guided practice and then the supports there, and it's gradually withdrawn. And they can be, I think the use of teaching assistants can be really useful in this area as well, in that the teaching assistants can be available and step in and help students and really scaffold them dependent on where the students are at specifically. And as we see the student become more and more proficient, we withdraw the support so that the student can learn to fly by themselves, fly in the world of learning. And then what we have, and this is the golden goal of all implementation of evidence, is really that implementation consistently across different classrooms and across the curriculum. And that's, I think, the golden dream of all of us in Australia, is how can we make sure that every classroom is really receiving the same quality of instruction. And that can be incredibly difficult. Structures like professional learning teams or implementation teams can help with that, to ensure that common practices are being shared across the learning teams.
And Tanya, before we go to questions, just want to make a point around implementation, because Robin has made a really terrific comment as well, just around the one of the approaches to doing that, in starting with teams and trialing and testing and building that up. So sort of seeding from within. One of the resources that Evidence for Learning has to help you through that journey is the implementation guidance report, which is also available on our website, but it is linked directly in the metacognition guidance report as well on page 34 and 35, which gives you a step through of what might metacognition and self-regulated learning look like through an implementation process for our school. And it's just an example. It might not work for everyone. We've tried to make it appropriately generic without it losing its meaning, but it's there for to support you through this process as well. So we really encourage you to look at not only the end bit, that putting evidence to work in the guidance report on metacognition, but the implementation guidance report as a standalone, which will apply much further beyond just the work that you're doing in metacognition. We did have one question, so this is firmly into question time with about 10 minutes. Tanya, I might ask you then this very first question.
Yes.
How does this concept of metacognition fit with or within the concept of self-directed learning? This was a question that was submitted to us through the registration process.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks also to the author of that question. Always great to receive your questions and know that you're engaging with the materials thoughtfully prior to us even launching the webinar, which is a big ask, I think, at this time of year. So talking about self-directed learning, so within that, and this is a quote here that I went and found a nice reference about that. So for students really to become self-directed learners, they must assess the demands of the task, evaluate their own knowledge and plan the approach and monitor their progress and adjust their strategies if needed. So really they are the key skills that we've been talking about, those metacognitive skills of planning, monitoring and evaluating throughout the process. So in that way, they're absolutely critical and fundamental to becoming self-directed. And another way of phrasing self-directed is a lifelong learner. And I think that's really what a lot of us got into teaching too, to encourage in our students, is to encourage that really passion of learning, and that they'll go on and keep learning for their whole lives, and that will be exciting to them. So that's that question there. If anyone has any other questions, let us know.
Lots of good comments, but I haven't seen any
great comments,
questions,
which is fine as well. We can give you an early mark because you've all been very good coming. Some of you in Melbourne here from 5 o'clock.
Oh, great question, Robin.
Great question.
So Robin's question is, I often struggle to marry assessment with metacognition. Any advice? This is genuinely a struggle for a lot of people, and we're grappling with this as well. There's certainly tools that are, if you're thinking about the assessment of metacognition development, that are sort of emerging at the moment. But we still haven't really seen anything too concrete. There's some really good work happening in the idea around portfolios and development, which I think are quite promising, quite assessment heavy and teacher time heavy, which is probably the downfall of those types of things. But we are definitely seeing progress, and hope that we'll see a few more really concrete tools coming out in the next little while. There's one that we've been looking at today through Pivot Learning, who are starting to really pinpoint some of the things that are sitting under metacognition. But we've also seen some really nice things done at a school level. So what are the pieces within metacognition that we value as a school? What are those sort of elements that we see in a student and how they demonstrate that, which can then be quite easily turned into a survey. But we'd love to be able to say there is one terrific survey that we recommend you all go and do, but have not seen that sort of silver bullet yet. Tanya, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you've covered up on that really nicely, I guess, just within assessment, but Robin will know this because her project implemented this, which is you can target feedback to the metacognitive aspects of the program. So that's the way you can embed it within assessment easily. But I'm just also thinking the building of rubrics that sit behind the assessment to include elements such as planning, monitoring and evaluating throughout a longer project, I think would be useful at that primary level that I know that you teach and lead at, Robin.
So this question I'll read out because it's not it's been directed at panelists, so not everyone will be able to see this one. What might a quick contrast between the 7 steps of embedding metacognition in classrooms and the gradual release model that a lot of teachers are aware of be? And I might start then hand over to Tanya if that's all right with you, Tanya. So we've actually documented the gradual release model in our teaching assistance guidance report as well, because that has a lot of applicability in that situation. The 7-step model is less about removing the scaffold that is supporting that particular task and more about the development of students being able to control and self-direct their own learning. So we don't want to be removing a particular point, and there is similarities certainly in the way that we talk about them, but this one is really tailored for metacognition as a stream, whereas the actual gradual release model has probably got applicability across a whole stream of activities. Tanya, do you have anything to add?
I certainly do not. That was lovely, Susanna.
All right, well, we might just do a bit of a wrap up with 5 minutes to go, and I'll let Tanya talk to the what's up next piece.
Yes, so excitedly, Evidence for Learning last year published the Early Childhood Education Toolkit, and so the Associate Director that heads up this work is Danielle Toon. So she'll be presenting alongside researchers from the University of Queensland, so Dr. Sally Stanton and Dr. Sandy Huen, who will be presenting on oral language development in the early years. So they've done some really lovely sheets around how to effectively encourage oral language development in the pre-primary setting. So looking predominantly at students from ages from 2 to 6. So please, this will be our next webinar, so please share this with your early education colleagues and primary sector as well. And we've also got, excitedly just today, right, Susanna, we're pretty excited about this. We've got the whole year's worth of webinars up. We're very pleased with ourselves in getting that up on the website. So that's the next one, and feel free to register for any more that you would like to attend during the year. And I'll hand back to Susanna for this one.
Great. So there's a number of ways, and I've tried to respond to a few of your comments as well, because it sounds like you're doing really exciting things. A number of ways to keep in touch with us. So either email Tanya, and I are very happy to respond to emails, or pick up the phone. We've got a newsletter that goes out monthly with a bit of a summary of what's happening around the sector in education and evidence, really designed for educators and school leaders. Social media following, so E4L tweets on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube, where we're uploading not only sessions like this, but videos that we're making for purpose around particular areas. Tanya mentioned our webinar series, which is up, so you can share that widely with all of your friends, and also our evidence-informed educator network, which gives you access to a lot of the materials that we're doing, and everything that we have on our site is open source and free for you to use and share. We just really like to hear about how you're sharing it and what you're doing with it, so please get in touch with us.
Yes, because that is the most exciting bit, is the way you take the evidence. And I must say, we'll be fortunate to be writing with educators across Australia this year, in writing with Teacher Magazine, how they've taken our evidence and actually turn that into practice in their classroom. So that's going to be exciting. So watch this space with our collaboration with Teacher Magazine. And excitingly for Teacher Magazine just today, Dr. Pauline Ho, I'm pointing over there because she's over there. She can stick her head over here, but I don't think she's going to, had an article released today with our director, Matt Diebel, too, on scaling effective practices in education. That is well worth a read as well. So, as we always say, and mean this most genuinely, thank you for joining us after your long day of teaching or leading. Some of you I've been fortunate to connect with in human form or face-to-face form as well, which we call it. I look forward to connecting with you again soon, and Susanna as well is out working as well across Australia. She's in Catherine this week. She's in Canberra next week. I'm in Darwin tomorrow. We go out across Australia, and we feel very fortunate to work with you all in making really turning evidence into practice in your settings. So thank you for having us, and have a great night.